This happened to me at the end of last summer, in a forest reserve that I usually visit for hiking in the late afternoon. It wasn't the first time I went alone, and as I already knew the route well and had a headlamp, I didn't worry too much about the time. I parked the car near 6:30 and started the quiet walk, enjoying that muffled silence of the forest, broken only by dry branches and insects. It was already around 7:20 when the sun practically disappeared, and I decided to go back. The trail was circular, so I continued on the normal path. It was in a tighter curve of the route that I saw her. A woman sitting in the middle of the trail, with her back to me, with her body a little bent forward and her face down. At first I thought she could have been sick, or even tripped and hurt. I approached calmly and asked if she needed help. No movement, no reaction. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to understand if she was in shock, fainted, or simply ignoring. The position in which she was sitting seemed strange, as if she was very tense or locked. I decided not to insist and walked slowly on the side of the trail, with my heart already kind of racing. That's when the atmosphere of the walk completely changed. I kept walking, this time with faster steps. As much as I tried to rationalize, maybe it was someone meditating or a stupid prank, there was something about her that made me uncomfortable. The trail made a slight climb, and a few minutes later, when I turned into another curve, my body stopped. She was there again, sitting the same way. Same hair, same clothes. There was no side trail, no shortcut, no chance of her having passed me without me seeing. I stopped in place, completely cold. My eyes tried to find some explanation, but the only thing I could feel was a dry fear, one of those that makes the throat tighten. This time, I didn't say anything. I was just watching, trying to understand if she was breathing, if she made any movement. The light of my flashlight trembled a little in my hand, and when I lit up her face harder, I realized that it was covered by her hair, as if it had been purposely hidden. That completely stood me. He didn't look like someone normal there. There was something wrong, out of place, and my instinct screamed to turn around. But the idea of coming back and somehow passing by it again was even worse. So I did the only thing I thought possible. I started walking sideways, trying to keep a distance, with my eyes fixed on her all the time. And it was only when I began to move away that I saw, for a second, her head tilting slightly, as if she was following me with her eyes, even without moving her body. I kept walking, without turning around, trying to keep my pace steady even with the panic growing inside. Each leaf he stepped on seemed to make too much noise. The air there was heavy, stuffy in a strange way. When I thought I had walked enough to leave her well behind, I allowed myself to look over my shoulder, and there was no one. The trail was empty, but that didn't bring me relief. On the contrary, because I knew I hadn't heard any steps, no sound of someone leaving there. It was as if she had simply disappeared. It was at that moment that I realized that something that night was not right, that I needed to get out of there as soon as possible. I hurried my pace. My focus now was just to get to the end of the trail, where I left the car. But a few minutes later, the path became more closed by the trees, and the flashlight began to fail. I stopped and hit her a few times until the light came back, and when I raised my face, I almost dropped it again. She was further ahead, for the third time, sitting in the middle of the trail the same way, as if I had never left there. My stomach turned. I didn't scream, I didn't say, I couldn't even think straight. I only took 2 steps back, trembling, and that's when the flashlight went out for good. An absurd silence took over the place, and I felt like I was being sucked into a hole. I turned around at the time and started running. I'm not one to run on the trail, even more at night, but at that moment it was pure instinct. But it seemed that, no matter how much I ran, the trail never ended. Everything seemed the same. Even with the flashlight off, the moonlight was weak enough for me to see minimally the way. But with each curve, with each tree, the feeling was that I was trapped in a loop. And then, without understanding how, I stumbled on a root and went to the ground. I fell with my face to the ground, grated my arm and hurt my knee, but the worst thing was the silence that came next. I felt that she was close. Still lying down, I heard footsteps, light, slow, approaching from behind. I tried not to move, I held my breath. For a second, I thought I was going to faint from fear. But the steps stopped mid. But there was no sound of someone leaving. They just stopped. I stayed there, motionless, for a time that seemed eternal. When I finally got the courage to look, there was no one. I got up staggering and kept walking, now slower, only with the sound of my own heart in my ears. But the worst was yet to come. When I finally saw the park gate and my car, it was standing right next to the driver's door, looking at me. I froze. It was as if my body refused to get close to the car. She was there, standing, with her head slightly tilted, her hair covering part of her face, and an outfit that seemed to have come out of another time. What scared me the most was the way she simply existed there, motionless, as if expecting something. I thought about turning around, but my legs didn't obey. So without taking my eyes off her, I walked slowly through the side of the parking lot. And when I looked away for a second, just to look forward, she was no longer there. Gone. Evaporated. No noise, no step, no trace. The car was unlocked. I ran in, locked the doors, and started from there with my heart in my throat. I only really breathed when I got home. Since then, I've never walked at night on any trail, no matter how safe it seemed. To this day, I don't know what that was. I've thought about illusion, tiredness, paranoia. But a part of me feels that it was real. That if I had stayed another second, maybe I wouldn't be here to tell this story. I've always been a fan of long walks, especially in state parks with more isolated trails. I like the peace, the sound of footsteps on the ground, the smell of the bush, and the feeling of being completely disconnected. That weekend, I took a new stretch that crossed quiet areas. I started early, with cloudy and cool weather, perfect for the type of walk I like. About 40 minutes later, I noticed a guy coming behind, not too close, but always in the same distance. The first time I looked, I didn't think it was too much. There were a lot of people doing that trail. But over time, that started to bother. I would stop to drink water, he would stop. I took a picture, he also stood still. I found it a coincidence at the beginning. But when I moved a little away from the main path to check an observation point and came back, he was exactly in the same place, looking at me. He didn't look lost or scared. Just stop. I tried to say good morning, a nod, anything. He didn't answer. He just stared at me with a neutral look, neither hostile nor sympathetic. I went back to the path and kept walking. A few minutes later, I heard his steps start again behind me. The trail had several bifurcations, and in one of them I decided to test. I took a path to the left, a little steep, that led to a clearing. I hid behind some big stones, just to see if he was really following me, or if it was just my impression. About 3 minutes later, there he was. He didn't look around, he didn't seem to look for me. He simply stopped right in the middle of the trail, stood there for a few seconds as if he knew I was watching, and then moved on, but slowly, as if he was waiting for me to come back. That gave me a chill down my spine. I went back to the original path, trying to stay calm. The entire forest seemed quieter than before, even the birds had stopped. I started to speed up my pace, and in some moments I even ran for short stretches, trying to keep my distance. But it was no use. Every time I looked back, he was still there. Never closer, nor further away. Always the same distance. It was as if he was measuring every step not to reach me, but also not to lose me. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. I continued for almost an hour with that unbearable feeling of having someone glued to my steps, without ever really approaching. I even stopped in the middle of the trail and waited on purpose, looking directly at him, in an attempt to force some reaction. He stopped too at the same moment. He stood still, just staring at me. He didn't say anything, he didn't smile, he didn't make any gesture. It was like facing a living wall. I tried to ask if he needed help or if he was lost, but I got no answer. After about 20 seconds of absolute silence, I turned my back and walked again. And soon after I heard his steps resuming behind me. The worst thing was realizing that there was no one else on the trail. I was alone with that guy in the middle of a huge reservation, with no cell phone signal and no security around. I began to imagine horrible scenarios, from robberies to something worse. In a more open stretch, I thought of letting him pass, so as not to have the feeling of being followed. I stopped sideways, pretending I was looking at the trees, and I made a gesture with my hand indicating that he could go ahead. He didn't move a muscle. I just stopped again, looking at me. That's when the thing went from discomfort to pure fear. I kept walking, this time trying to accelerate a little, but without running. Every time he looked back, he was still there, with the same empty expression. No words, no sign that it was someone who just wanted to do the trail too. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that he had no backpack, no bottle of water, or anything that anyone would take for such a long walk. It seemed like he was there just to follow me. I started to sweat cold. The sound of his steps behind me was rhythmic, constant, always keeping the same distance. After a while, I approached one of the support points of the trail, a clearing with a wooden bench and a signboard. I sat there, trying to pretend I was just resting. The man stopped at the edge of the clearing and stood for a few minutes. I tried not to look directly, but I could feel his eyes on me. Suddenly, he simply turned and left the trail on one side, entering the closed vegetation with no visible path. I stood there for a long time, trying to understand what had just happened. The feeling of relief didn't last long. When I finally decided to continue, I realized that my feet were heavy, as if the whole body had gone on alert. Even so, I moved on, hoping not to see that man anymore. But about 15 minutes later, I turned a curve and he was there, in the middle of the trail, stopped, as if he was already waiting for me. This time, I didn't stare at me. I was on my back, as if I were watching something between the trees. I stopped immediately, feeling my heart race. How had he gotten there so fast? There was no other parallel trail, nor shortcuts. It was impossible for him to have overtaken me without me noticing. I stood still, waiting for him to turn around, do anything. But he remained motionless, as if it were a statue. I thought about going back, but it was too far from the entrance, and the sky was already starting to get dark. So I decided to go outside the trail, passing through the bast, bypassing that point to avoid crossing it. It took me about 10 minutes to get back to the main trail, and when I did, he was no longer there. But still, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I was being watched. The last stretches of the trail were the worst. I was already exhausted. The sun was almost setting, and every sound of the forest seemed louder, closer. Branches breaking, leaves moving, everything made my head turn. At one point, I heard footsteps coming behind me again. I looked back, nothing. But the steps continued. I accelerated, almost stumbling on stones and roots, without the courage to look once again. That's when I got to a fork. The sign indicated that both paths led back to the entrance, but by different routes. I chose the one on the right, which was a little longer, but seemed more open. I started to go down the stretch of stone when, in the reflection of the cell phone, which I used to illuminate the floor, I saw a shadow behind me. I came right away. I could no longer know what was real and what was paranoia. All I know is that the steps came back, and this time more hasty. That's where I ran. I ran like I had never run before. The trail didn't seem to end, the air burned in my lungs, and I just wanted to get out of there. When I finally saw the parking lot, I had the impression that I was going to faint. I reached my car and entered without even looking back. It wasn't until I locked the door and started the engine that I realized how much I was shaking. I stayed there for a few minutes, trying to understand what had happened. I looked out the window one last time before leaving there, and I swear I saw someone standing on the edge of the trail, where she was with the parking lot. It was just a dark, motionless silhouette. When I turned back and the light illuminated the point, there was no one else. I got home that night completely bewildered. I told a friend, trying to sound rational, but I felt bad just remembering. A few days later, out of curiosity or idiocy, I entered a forum of trailblazers in the region, and saw an old topic from more than a year before, describing something almost identical to what I went through. One user commented, "If he doesn't speak, don't stop. Just keep walking." Since then, I have never done any hiking alone, and I avoid any mention of that region. I used to do short hikes near the city on weekends. It was a way to relax, disconnect a little. On that specific day, I chose a lesser-known trail, indicated by a coworker. She said that the path was beautiful, calmer, and passed through an area of closed forest that ended in a clearing. I left early with water, flashlight, charged cell phone, and everything I usually take. The weather was cloudy, which even pleased me. I don't like walking under strong sun. The beginning of the trail was very quiet, until I noticed something out of the ordinary in the first 20 minutes. There was a light blue t-shirt on the branch of a tree. It was hanging as if someone had put it there on purpose. I ignored it at first, thinking that someone could have forgotten, but about 5 minutes later, I saw a backpack thrown next to the road, kind of torn. It looked childish, with character drawings that I recognized from some cartoon. It was dirty with dirt, with the zipper partially open. I was bothered by that. It didn't look like old garbage. Everything seemed recent. I looked around looking for someone, but there was no sound of footsteps, no voices. The forest was completely silent, of that kind of silence that even the wind seems to avoid. And that's where the real discomfort began, that feeling that I should come back, but I couldn't convince my head that it was reason enough. Curiosity, maybe. But curiosity, in this case, took me too far. Further ahead, I saw a small sneaker, one of those children's with Velcro. It was overturned sideways, wet because of the wet earth and covered by some leaves. The insole was partially detached, as if it had been torn from the foot during a rush. That's when I started to feel really bad. That was not normal. It was very spaced, as if it had been left at specific points. I took my cell phone to register things, but there was no signal there anymore. I tried to call the police, just in case, but not even that worked. The sky was darker and the natural light decreased. Still, I continued, with the fastest step and the senses on alert. Almost at the entrance of the most closed part of the trail, I found a cell phone thrown next to a stone. It was pink with a teddy bear cap. The screen was broken, and it wouldn't turn on. That was the last straw. I stood for a few good seconds staring at that device, imagining what kind of situation had made someone leave all these objects behind, especially children's objects. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was a school camp that passed by there, but everything was messy, and there was no sign of a group. And more importantly, why didn't anyone come back to pick it up? Why was the cell phone broken? That started to seem like a trail to me, as if it was being purposely left for someone to follow. I felt a chill in my stomach when, after walking for a few more minutes, I saw a lunchbox fallen on the floor, open, with crumbs still inside. It seemed to have been used that morning. It was clean on the outside, with colorful drawings. I can't explain, but that was worse than the other objects. There was something intimate, everyday there, and the idea that a child was going through that began to frighten me. I started looking to the sides all the time, hoping to see someone, hear a voice, anything. But all I heard was the muffled sound of my own steps and the trees creaking in the wind. No sign of people, no parallel trail, no noise that indicated that it was alive. Just the heavy silence and an unbearable feeling that I shouldn't be there. I decided to come back. It no longer made sense to continue on that path, especially alone. But at the exact moment I turned to return, I had the clear impression that something had moved between the bushes on my left. I didn't see it clearly, but the sound of branches breaking was real. I stood. The type of paralysis that only those who have felt genuine fear know. I didn't know if I ran, if I hid, or if I ignored it and pretended I didn't hear. The heart shot in a way that made me a little dizzy. I walked fast, trying to stay calm, without making too much noise. But with every step I took, it seemed that someone, or something, followed my rhythm among the trees outside the trail. I tried to convince myself that it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a lost dog, but something didn't hit. The sound of the steps was too heavy, too measured, as if it imitated exactly mine. And when I stopped walking for a moment, just to confirm, the steps also stopped. I stood there in silence, trying to control my breathing, listening to the wind beating on the leaves and that tense silence taking over. That's when, in the middle of the trail in front of me, I saw a small fallen doll, turned on her back, with her dress torn. I swear she wasn't there before. I had gone through that stretch minutes before, and I would remember something so specific. At this point, my mind was already going far, trying to fit 1,000 theories for that. None of them made sense. I took my cell phone to call someone, but as expected, no signal. I tried to take a few more steps, passing by the doll without touching, and I almost stumbled upon something further. A children's sandal, dirty with clay, lying on my side. She didn't seem abandoned for a long time. That's when I realized that the whole way back was now marked with these small objects, as if someone had put everything on purpose, as if they wanted me to see it. What scared me the most was that it wasn't there when I came. Someone had put that after I passed. I decided I couldn't keep following that trail anymore. My instinct screamed that I needed to get out of there. I turned to go back the same way as before, but now it seemed different, as if the trees had closed a little more. Even so, I started to walk faster, almost running. With each curve, more objects, a lunchbox, a broken toy, a t-shirt with stains. They were being placed while I was walking. Someone was nearby, and watching me. That's when I heard, very quietly, a whisper coming from the woods. "You saw everything." My heart raced like never before. There was no more doubt. I was being hunted. I really started running. I didn't care anymore if it would hurt me or lose me. I just needed to get out of there. The forest seemed to close around, and each shadow seemed to hide something. I tripped over a branch, fell, and when I got up, something on the floor made me freeze. It was a notebook sheet, folded in half. When I opened it, my blood froze. It was handwritten, with a children's handwriting, "You're next." I let go of the sheet and ran out harder. It was only when I saw a group of cyclists in the distance that I managed to stop. They saw me completely pale, with my face scratched and my breathing out of control. I couldn't explain anything right at the time. I just asked for a ride to the entrance of the trail. Since that day, I've never gone hiking alone again. And to be honest, I avoid any kind of walking in an isolated place. I tried to report what happened to the park administration a few days later, but they looked at me with a mixture of disbelief and concern. They said that the trail was safe, that no one had reported anything strange, and that there was no record of recent disappearances. I wanted to believe that maybe I had exaggerated, that my mind filled gaps with fear. But what prevents me from forgetting is that sequence of objects, all recent, all childish, all placed on purpose. Even today, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had kept going, or if I had touched the doll, or opened that lunchbox. I don't know if anyone was trying to scare me, or if that was something worse. All I know is that that forest kept something that didn't want to be found. And for some reason, that day, she chose to show me a little of what was inside. I never found out who or what was behind that, and maybe it's better that way. I've always been hiking with my dog Thor, a big mutt full of energy, who has always accompanied me even on the most difficult routes. We knew well the paths of the state park here near home, and that afternoon, as always, we left with the light backpack and he pulling the leash with excitement. The sun was low at the end of the day, but as the trail was short, I found it quiet. We walked for about 20 minutes without any problem, until he crashed out of nowhere. It simply stopped halfway, its paws firm, the hairs on the back goosebumps. He began to growl low, staring at a more closed part of the forest in front of us, as if he had seen something there. But I didn't see anything. I tried to pull the leash, called, I even joked to see if he relaxed, but nothing. He began to retreat, still growling, and his eyes were wide in a way I had never seen in him. I thought maybe it was some wild animal. Wild boars and even jaguars had already been seen there, although it was rare. I stood still for a few seconds trying to listen to any noise in the woods, but there was total silence. No wind, no animal, no leaf rand. That gave me a chill. I took a deep breath and decided it was better to go back. When I turned to retrace the path, that's when I noticed the footprints. There were barefoot marks on the clay, going in the same direction as us, but they weren't there on the way. They started suddenly, out of nowhere, in the middle of the trail, and they were mixed with mine. I stopped there, staring at that for a few seconds, trying to find some logical explanation. Maybe someone had entered the trail after us? But it didn't make sense. We were in the middle of the route, and there was no other entrance there, only closed forest. Besides, the footprints were weird. They were very deep, as if the person was barefoot and walking slowly, almost dragging his feet. And another thing, they only had footprints going, none coming back. Even looking at the side of the trail, where the earth was also wet, you couldn't see any more signs. Just that strange trail, mixed with the marks of my boot and Thor's paws. Thor began to pull back hard, something he never did. The animal was terrified, trembling. I started to feel that weight in my chest, that feeling that there is something wrong, even if nothing has happened yet. I decided to speed up. Every meter we walked back, I looked to the side, to the body, hoping to see someone leave there. But there was nothing. The worst thing was that, even retreating, the footprints kept appearing, side by side with mine. As if the person, or whatever it was, had walked with me since the moment Thor stopped. But I didn't see anyone. I didn't hear footsteps. Nothing. When I got closer to the beginning of the trail, I realized that something was different. I can't explain exactly what. It was the same path, but it seemed distorted. When you enter a familiar place and feel that there is something out of place, even if you can't point out what. The trees seemed closer, the air more stuffy. Thor was almost dragging me, and I left it, with my heart racing. But what marked me the most was when I stopped again, looked at the floor, and the barefoot footprints were still there. And more, now they were only on my left side, as if someone was walking glued to me. I don't know why, but I felt an absurd desire to look to my left. But I forced myself not to do that. Something inside me screamed not to look. It was an irrational fear, even childish, but too strong. I followed with my head down, without turning around, just pressing the pace. Thor seemed to understand what I was feeling, because he didn't look to the side either. He just pulled. When we left the most closed part of the trail and returned to the open area near the parking lot, the wind was strong and cold. That's when I had the courage to look back. No footprint. The floor was clean, as if no one had passed by there. At the time I felt bad. A sudden nausea, a strange pressure on my head, as if I had gone down a saw too fast. I stood for a few seconds trying to understand what had just happened. It was as if that last stretch of the trail had been left behind in a way that could not be accessed again. Like, as if it had closed. Thor shrank next to me, panting, staring at the entrance of the forest, as if he expected something to come out of there at any moment. And the worst thing is that I also expected it. I had the feeling that, if we stayed there for a few more minutes, something would appear. I went back to the car shaking. I didn't even check if I had forgotten anything. I just went in with Thor and locked the doors. In the rearview mirror, I kept looking at the beginning of the trail, hoping to see someone, or something, standing there watching me. But no one showed up. I started the car and got out of there as fast as I could. On the road, I tried to rationalize, to think it could have been paranoia, but the footprints didn't leave my head. They weren't there before, and the way they seemed to follow my steps, as if it was by my side all the time, but I hadn't noticed. In the following days, I became obsessed. I reviewed the photos I took that day, but there was nothing strange in them. No figure in the background, no suspicious shadow, nothing. But I swear there was an image that gave me goosebumps. It was a photo of Thor sitting looking straight to the left, exactly where the footprints appeared later. As if he had already realized that long before me. I showed the photo to a friend who also enjoys hiking, and he commented that he had already heard rumors about that region. Badly told stories of people who disappeared there, of noises in the woods, of trails that seemed to change places. I've never listened to these things, until now. Since then, I haven't returned to that place. I don't even intend to. I still do trails, but I always choose busier, more open routes. Thor also became different after that day, more suspicious, more alert. Any strange noise, he stops and stares, as if expecting to see someone again. I also look, and every time, I get that silly fear of turning to the side and seeing footprints appearing there, out of nowhere, accompanying me. I don't know what happened that day, but I'm sure of one thing. I wasn't alone on that trail. And whatever was there with me, I knew exactly what I was doing. I'm not the type who easily believes in strange things, but what happened to me on that trail was different from everything I've ever lived. I had taken a few days off to do a solo trekking through a forest reserve that is about 2 hours from the city. My girlfriend, Julia, couldn't come because she was traveling for work on the other side of the country. The trail was well signposted. I had already done half of it the previous year, so I was quiet, with a tent, GPS, everything right. On the second day, when I was right in the middle of the road, more isolated, something very strange began to happen. I was walking slowly, enjoying the silence, when I heard someone calling me. Not screaming, but in a clear, insistent tone. The part that made me freeze was that the voice was Julia's. Exactly her voice, the way she usually calls me when she wants my attention. I stood still for a few seconds, trying to understand. The sound came from inside the forest, outside the trail, and called me by name, with a weird calm. I thought about the possibility of being someone similar, but it didn't make any sense. Even so, I started to follow the sound, thinking that maybe it was some bad joke or hallucination caused by fatigue. As I advanced, the sound was getting clearer. She called me again and again, but always in the same tone, low, firm, as if she was seeing where I was and trying to drive me. The most bizarre thing was that, despite the dense forest, there was no sign of anyone around. No footprint, no figure, nothing, just the voice, which now came more from above, as if it were at some higher or more distant point. When I tried to call back, no one answered. Just silence. And then again my name, repeated as if it had been recorded. But it didn't look like a recording. She looked like her. I felt completely out of place. The vegetation began to get more closed, the ground moist and unstable. I felt that I was moving away quickly from the main trail, but it was as if something inside me insisted on continuing. I tried to rationalize, but my body was going. The voice began to change subtly. It was still Julia's, but it gained a more shrill, sharper tone, almost as if it were distorting with each call. It was only when I tripped over a root and almost fell down the ravine that the shock made me stop. My breathing was accelerated and my forehead sweating cold. I looked around and had no idea how to get back. I took my cell phone to try to use the GPS, but of course, no signal. The offline map didn't help much, because I was already well off the marked route. I stood there for a few minutes, listening. The voice had stopped. A total silence took over the forest, and only then did I realize how constant that sound had been until then. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. I tried to go back the same way, but everything seemed the same. Dense trees, branches on the ground, without any clear reference point. That's when I noticed something else. There were no footprints of mine. No one-way trail. Not a mark on the floor. It was as if I had appeared there out of nowhere. I started walking back, trying to stay calm, but that's when I heard another sound. This time, it was as if something was walking with me on the side but behind the vegetation. The kind of noise we recognize on the spot, leaves being stepped on, branches breaking, steps. I didn't run, but I accelerated my pace and tried to convince myself that it was just an animal. But the steps continued, and suddenly the voice came back. But now, it wasn't Julia's anymore. It was similar, but it wasn't. There was something wrong with the tone, as if someone was imitating badly. That's when it gave me that real, instinctive fear, the kind that tells you that there's something very wrong going on. I stood still, trying to understand where the voice was coming from, but it seemed to come from everywhere. It was taller, thinner, almost like a scream disguised as a call. I repeated in a low voice, "This is not Julia. This is not Julia." As if that would help me maintain my sanity. I started walking in the opposite direction to the sound, hoping to find the main trail again, or any sign of civilization. At each step, the feeling of being observed only increased. There was something following me, I felt it, and when I looked back, I saw the best move. It was fast, as if someone had bent down. My heart almost stopped. I continued walking for about 15 minutes, until I finally heard a different sound, the barking of a dog, distant. Was it someone? Another trailer? I screamed for help, desperate, but the only answer was silence. A few more steps ahead, I saw a mark on the floor. It looked like a footprint mine. I had returned to the same place where it all began, even swearing I had walked in a straight line. And that's where I saw a big stone with something carved in it, a strange symbol, and below it my name. My name, complete, with a letter that was not mine. That froze me. That stone with my name gave me a dread difficult to describe. Who would have done that? When? And why? I didn't tell anyone that I would do that trail. I didn't post anything. I didn't mark a route. My brain began to think about all the most absurd possibilities. I started running without the right direction, just to get away from there, until I tripped and fell badly, tearing my knee. I stayed on the floor for a while, breathing heavily, listening to the sounds of the woods. He had no more voice, just the normal sounds of the forest coming back little by little, as if something had left me alone, or tired of playing. I managed to find the main trail after hours. It was almost night. I arrived at the car trembling, with my cell phone still without signal and my knee bleeding. I was only able to sleep days later, and to this day, every time I enter a trail, I hear Julia's voice echoing in my head. I tried to tell her this, but it was clear that she thought I just had an anxiety outbreak. Maybe it really was. But whenever I remember that symbol on the stone with my name carved, I know there was something there with me. And I know that if I had followed that voice to the end, maybe I would never have come back. I went back there only once, months later, just to try to understand. I took a friend with me, and made sure not to tell anything about what had happened before. We followed the same trail, but the place where I found the stone seemed different. The clearing was still there, but there was no sign of any mark on the floor, nor of the stone with my name, nor of the symbol. My friend thought I was inventing everything, that I confused the place. But I remember perfectly. I remember the texture of the stone, the scratched background of the letters, the exact shape of the symbol. I can't have imagined that. Since then I avoid hiking alone. And when I hear a voice coming from where it shouldn't come from, even if it seems to be someone I know, I ignore it. I never went to the end of a trail without thinking twice. I don't know what that was. A trap? A very bad joke. Something that hides there and takes advantage of those who are vulnerable? I'll never get that answer. But one thing I know, if you hear a familiar voice in the middle of the forest, even more calling your name, don't answer. And don't follow. I've never liked busy trails very much, but on that sunny Sunday we decided to face a new route, very popular among the adventurers of the region. There were 4 of us, me, my girlfriend, and 2 other friends. We started early and continued quietly, with a lot of people coming and going along the way. Halfway through the journey, one of ours stumbled upon something in the middle of the low vegetation. It was an old digital camera, one of those compact ones. It was a little dirty with dirt, with the battery cover open and scratches on the lens, but curiously it still worked. The first reaction was to laugh, thinking that someone had lost and the camera was forgotten there. We sat on a fallen trunk to rest, and out of curiosity, we began to see what was on the memory card. The first images were typical of a trail, trees, landscapes, one or another shaky selfie. But as we progressed, the photos began to get uncomfortable. Some showed unknown people walking ahead, taken from afar, half sideways, as if whoever was photographing wanted to avoid being noticed. Then photos taken from behind bushes began to appear, clearly hidden. The angle was low, half crooked, focusing on groups of different trailers. That's when we noticed something even stranger. One of the last images clearly showed the four of us, taken that same day. I was tying my sneakers, my girlfriend was laughing at something, and the other two talking. None of us remembered someone with a camera nearby at that moment, and that made everything freeze. The photo seemed to have been taken in that clearing, where we stop around 10 a.m. The strangest detail was the angle. It seemed that it had been taken from inside the forest, from a low position, as if someone was squatting or lying behind the bushes. The sharpness was good enough to show expressions on our faces, and none of us looked at the camera. No one noticed anything at all. We spent the last few minutes trying to remember if someone strange had passed by, but everyone said the same thing. We only saw ordinary couples and families, no one standing or watching us like that. From there, the climate of the trail changed completely. We followed in silence, looking to the sides all the time, and even the sounds of the forest seemed louder. My friend, who had found the camera, put it in his backpack, but no one had the courage to look at the images anymore. When we arrived at the nearest support point, a kind of improvised kiosk with a weak cell phone signal, we tried to call the police to report what we found, but the call dropped twice. We decided to finish the trail straight and go back to the parking lot, already a little paranoid. It was at this moment that we realized a detail that made everything worse. As we returned, we noticed a man standing about 20 meters from the main trail. He was completely motionless, turned in our direction, but you couldn't see his right face because of the shade of the trees. What really caught attention was what he was holding, a compact camera, exactly like the one we had found. My stomach turned at the time. When we discreetly pointed to show each other, he turned his back and entered the forest without any hurry, as if he knew we wouldn't go after him. We stood there, kind of in shock, until someone suggested to keep walking without looking back. And that's what we did. When we finally got back to the car, the first thing I did was check if the camera was still in my friend's backpack. It was. That is, that guy was with another camera, or with the same one, and somehow he had taken it back. This idea gave me goosebumps. Arriving home, we passed the images to the computer and copied them all. One of the last photos, which we hadn't noticed before, showed the partially hidden face of a man, reflected in a mirror stuck in a tree, like those who are in dangerous curves. It was as if he had tried to take an accidental selfie. His expression was strange, fixed, and he seemed to be wearing the same blouse as the guy we saw in the forest. The next day, we took the camera to a police station in the region and explained everything we saw. The policeman was attentive, but you could see that they didn't take it too seriously. They kept the memory card, said they were going to investigate, and let us go. We never had a return on that again. The trail, which has always been an escape from the routine for me, became a source of anxiety. I spent weeks trying to forget that man's face and the fact that he was already there, among us, before we even knew. Even today, sometimes I review the photos we took on our own that day, just to make sure there is no one deep down that we didn't notice. The strangest of all, a few days later, I received a message on Instagram. It was from a newly created profile, no photo, no followers. The message only said, "Did you like the walk?" with a smiling face. I blocked it on the spot. We never found out who that guy was or if he was really following us before. All I know is that it was real. The camera, the photos, the presence. Someone was there, watching us closely, and probably still out there, doing the same thing with other people. This happened to me last year, on a weekend that I decided to spend alone hiking in a forest reserve near the state border. I usually camp alone from time to time to relax, and this specific trail was relatively safe. I had done it before. I took everything right: tent, packaged food, first aid kit, GPS. The trail had some forks, but as I knew the route well, I decided to explore one of the least used paths, further into the forest. That's when things started to get weird. After about a couple of hours walking through this detour, I noticed something unusual. There were marks on the floor like footprints and recent drag, and the smell of smoke in the air. I thought it could be some other trailer or someone camping there. I followed the smell and ended up finding a small camp in the middle of the bust, a bonfire still releasing embers, a cloth on the floor with open food, cans of cans, bottle of water, even a folded blanket on the side. But there was no one. No backpack, no sound. No step, no conversation. Everything indicated that someone was there until minutes before, but the surrounding forest was completely silent. too silent. I stood still watching everything, trying to understand. It was too strange. If it was someone camping, why leave food open like that? And the bonfire, still embered, which meant they had left there for a maximum of 10 or 15 minutes. I decided to call, raised my voice and shouted, "Is there anyone there?" But all I heard back was the muffled sound of the wind among the trees. Neither bird nor insect, nothing. That started to give me a physical discomfort, a feeling that I shouldn't be there. I had the impulse to leave, but something made me want to better understand what was happening. I walked slowly through the camp. I tried to see if there was any recent trail coming out of there, but I didn't find any new footprints. Everything was very clean, too tidy. Even the way the cloth with the food was spread out gave a strange feeling, as if it were something assembled in a hurry, just to look natural. When I bent down to take a closer look at one of the cans, I felt that strange chill on the back of my neck, as if someone was behind me. I'll turn around on the spot. Just the trees and the overwhelming silence. That's when I started to think that maybe that wouldn't have been an ordinary camp. I started photographing the place with my cell phone, just in case I needed to report anything later. When I took the picture of the bonfire, I noticed a strange thing on the display. There was a dark blur right on the side of the image, as if there was something or someone there in the corner of the lens. I turned quickly to look, but there was absolutely nothing. I deleted it and took another one. The blur was there again, in the same place. I decided not to take any more. I put my cell phone away, took a deep breath and started to move away, returning to the main trail. The feeling of being watched only increased. With every step I took, it seemed that the sounds of the forest diminished even more. I started walking faster, but avoiding running so as not to look panicked. At all times I looked back, but I didn't see anyone. The silence was already stunning me. When I finally got back to the most used trail, it was as if the world was back to normal. You could hear birds, leaves moving, even the distant sound of water. But the feeling that something had followed me so far didn't go away. I sat down for a while to breathe, but I decided to leave straight away. I kept going down the way back without stopping. At all times I turned to check if there was no one coming after, and even with the sun already starting to go down, I felt a strange warmth in my body, as if I was being watched by something I didn't want to be seen. When I arrived at the parking lot, there was only one more car besides mine, an old truck, a little dusty with dark windows. I thought it was strange because she wasn't there when I arrived. I got into my car as fast as I could, locked the doors and started the engine with my trembling hand. In the rearview mirror, I saw the truck turn on too. I froze for a few seconds. I don't know why, but I thought it wasn't a coincidence. I quickly left the parking space, turned around and entered the dirt road towards the highway. The truck was stopped. When I looked in the mirror one last time, I had the impression of seeing a figure standing in the woods behind her. It was as if someone was watching me again, motionless in the shade. I don't know if all that was real or just paranoia, but I swore to myself that I don't step on that trail alone anymore. I usually go hiking alone on weekends to relieve stress, especially when the city starts to suffocate me. On that specific day, I chose a mountain that was not well known, but had good recommendations because it was quiet and safe. The climb was steep, but the weather was pleasant and the dense forest gave a good feeling of isolation. After about 30 minutes of walking, I began to notice some small stone towers positioned at some points on the trail. They seemed to be made with care, some well stacked, others half crooked, like those markings that some trailblazers leave. But there was something different in them. When I crouched down to better observe one of them, I realized that there was something carved at the bottom of one of the stones. It was a simple but disturbing word, help. I kept going up, thinking it could be a coincidence or just someone joking. But soon after, I saw another pile, and one more. On this Monday, what was written was a name followed by a date. That made me uneasy, because the date was only 3 days ago. It didn't look like an ordinary memorial, it was almost as if it were a message. And even worse, someone could have passed by there recently. I got that weight on my chest, but I decided to continue. After the 4th tower, I started walking slower. Under the stones of that one there was something even weirder. The word "don't come back." The wood next to it looked burnt at the ends, as if someone had made a fire right there. I started to get really nervous. I looked around and didn't see anyone, but the silence was different, without the sound of birds, without wind, just that kind of muffled silence that leaves anyone on alert. I decided to take my cell phone to register the towers, but I realized that the signal had completely disappeared. This had never happened there before. I tried not to freak out. I was already almost at the top, and I imagined that, if I came back now, it would only increase my paranoia. But as I went up, I realized that the towers had begun to disappear. They simply stopped showing up. I was relieved for a few minutes, until I noticed that the stretch of the trail I would return by no longer looked the same. There were broken branches halfway, recent footprints in the mud, and no tower. No brand. Not even the first one I had observed down there. It was as if everything had been taken away while I went up, and that gave me a horrible chill. I kept going down faster, trying to ignore the idea that someone could be around. But that discomfort didn't go away. I didn't feel like I was alone. Even without hearing anything specific, it was as if my head knew there was something wrong, as if the place had changed while I was upstairs. The forest seemed denser, darker, as if the weather had turned out of nowhere. And there was no more sign of the well-demarcated trail that I knew. Everything seemed slightly out of place. I tried to use the GPS, but the app crashed every time I opened it. At one point, I heard a snack coming from behind. I stopped, without the courage to look. It wasn't an ordinary branch breaking. It was like the sound of a stone rolling and hitting another. When I finally got the courage to turn around, I didn't see anyone. But, about 3 meters from the side of the trail, there was a new stone tower. That irised me inside, because I swear there wasn't any there a second before. I slowly approached the stone tower, trying to understand if it was just my paranoia. I crouched and lifted one of the stones from the base. Below there was something carved, a name and a date, the same as that day. Suddenly, I realized that each of those towers could be more than just hills. What if they were markers? Warnings? Graves? I felt my whole body stiffen. The idea that someone or something was writing that in real time, while I was walking, was more than disturbing. I got up and started running, ignoring the pain in my feet. The more I ran, the more it seemed to me that the forest was closing around me. Normal sounds, such as birds and wind between the leaves, had completely disappeared. The only noise was that of my breathing and the impact of my own steps on the floor. When I finally saw the exit of the trail and returned to the dirt parking lot, my car was there, but the only other vehicle I had seen when I arrived was no longer there. At the edge of the entrance of the trail, a last tower of stones, very small, was waiting for me, with a word carved underneath. I went. I never went back to that trail, and just thinking about it today already gives me a tightness in my chest. I researched for days later, trying to understand if it was part of any local tradition, if someone had already reported it, or if those towers meant something I didn't know. I didn't find anything. No reference to stones carved with words like those, no group that marked trails that way. It was as if that had been done just for me, just that day. As if I had been observed from the beginning. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I had dismantled some more tower, or if I had followed back along the same trail. And every time I pass by any place with stone stacks, even on the most popular trails, I keep looking more closely than I would like. Looking for a word, a name, or a date that has not yet arrived. That Sunday, I decided to explore a little-known trail that a coworker had mentioned weeks before. It was one of those almost forgotten routes, without signs and with a bust growing halfway, but with incredible views according to him. As soon as I parked my car near the improvised entrance, I noticed an older vehicle right next to it. It looked like an 80s sedan, covered in dust, with dry leaves stuck to the windshield and cobwebs on the door handles. I found it curious, but I imagined that some resident of the region could have left it there a long time ago. The car was clearly locked and didn't seem to have been used recently. The trail itself was beautiful but lonely. I walked for hours, moving further and further away from the road, and I only crossed paths with 2 cyclists returning in the opposite direction. When the sun began to go down, I decided to go back. I didn't want to be in that thicket darkening fast. When I finally got back to the point where the old car was, it was no longer there. At the time, I thought I was going crazy. But what made me freeze completely were the marks of fresh footprints, like dirty boots, leading exactly to the point where the car had been before. Footprints that didn't exist before, because I passed by there early. I stood there for a few good seconds, trying to rationalize. Maybe someone had come to pick up the car at that interval. But then I realized that I hadn't heard any engine during the whole trail, and that place was too isolated for someone to simply show up, unlock and drive away, without me even hearing the tires on the ground or the door slamming. The strangest thing was that the footprints wouldn't go away. They simply emerged from the edge of the forest, went to where the car was, and stopped. as if whoever was there had disappeared along with the vehicle. I went back to my car, trying not to look too far. That feeling of being watched was getting stronger as I opened the door. When I slammed the door and started it, I just wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. But before starting, I looked one last time through the rearview mirror. There at the end of the dirt road, among the trees, I saw a silhouette standing still. It didn't moss. There were no details. Just there, staring at me. The road was narrow, so I accelerated straight forward, and I only breathed right when I got to the asphalt. Since then, I've never returned to the trail. But sometimes, when I drive on similar dirt roads, I get that impression that some old car may be parked again waiting. I usually go hiking with a certain frequency, especially in well-structured parks. Nothing too radical, just to relax. On that day, I chose a route that I had already done twice before, in an environmental reserve near where I live. It was a circular path, with visible markings on trees and signs at key points. I left around 11 a.m. with a light backpack, water bottle, snack, and charged cell phone. The weather was good, clear sky, and few people on the trail. I remember going through 3 small groups right at the beginning, which gave me that feeling of security that we like to have when we are alone in an isolated place. I took the route quietly, enjoying the walk, stopped for lunch in a clearing, and around 2:30 p.m., I decided to come back. The problem started there. I went back the same way I knew, but the plates disappeared. Literally. I clearly remembered a red mark on a fallen tree next to a fork. This time, there was nothing there. Only denser vegetation and a trail that seemed less used, as if no one had passed by there for a long time. I even thought that I was too distracted and that I had taken the wrong path, but I soon realized that it was not really that. The land seemed familiar, but it also looked like another place at the same time. It's hard to explain. It was as if everything had changed subtly, as if someone had redone the forest with the same pieces, only scrambled. I kept walking, trying to stay calm. I thought about going back the same way, but everything seemed the same, without any reference point. Even the sound of the forest looked different. More stuffy. What used to be a well-marked trail now had low branches and loose stones, as if no one had passed by there for years. The sun began to go down, and with it, that feeling of urgency that we try to ignore, but that grows in the stomach. I took my cell phone to see the GPS, but it didn't load the map. It only showed my location as a loose spot in the middle of nowhere, without a trail, no contour. No network. Zero signal. I decided to move on, since going back seemed impossible. The logic was that, sooner or later, I would find the dirt road that surrounded the reserve. But the terrain began to change again. The vegetation became more closed, the floor more humid, as if I had entered another part of the forest, one that was not even part of the park. I started to feel a strange smell in the air, like wet earth mixed with something sweet, a little sickening. With each step, the trail was getting tighter, darker, as if it were being swallowed by the forest. And the weirdest thing, I didn't hear any more sound. No birds, wind, crickets. It was a dry silence, which made me stop and look around several times, feeling that there was something wrong. It was at this point that I realized something that froze me inside. My own footprints, which I must have been leaving on the wet floor, were simply not there. I looked back and there was no trace, as if I hadn't passed by there. I crouched down, touched the floor. It was cute, wet enough to mark, but there was no mark of mine. That gave me a strange feeling, as if I was walking in circles, or somewhere I didn't want to be tracked. And then, for the first time, I began to consider that I was no longer on the same track. Not in the common sense. It wasn't just disorientation. It was as if I had been out of place. I kept walking, but the tiredness began to weigh. I had no idea how many hours had already passed. I sat on a stone and tried to take a deep breath, forcing the mind to think rationally. I took a cereal bar from my backpack, and when I went to throw the paper in the side pocket, I saw something that gave me whole goosebumps. There was a small crumpled note at the bottom of the pocket, but I didn't remember putting anything there. I unfolded with my hands shaking. There were only 2 words written in pen in crooked letters. Come back now. The handwriting seemed childish. That made me jump up. The forest, which already seemed strange, became suffocating. I started walking faster, trying to retrace the path even without being sure where I was. I marked the trees with small scratches with my pocket knife, just to make sure I wasn't walking in circles. And even so, I went twice through the same fallen trunk with an unmistakable shape, as if it had been cut in half. But I knew I had gone straight. The feeling of being observed became stronger. It wasn't animal noise or paranoia. It was as if there was someone a few meters from me, always out of my field of vision. I tried to scream for help, but the sound seemed muffled, as if the bush swallowed my voice. That's when I started hearing the snats. Slow, spaced. A branch being stepped on here, another there. It wasn't any animal running. It was something or someone approaching slowly. I suddenly turned around a few times, but I never saw anything. The only thing I noticed was that the smell of the air changed. It had a strong smell of burnt wood, as if there was a bonfire nearby. I followed the smell, thinking that maybe it was another group camping. But when I got close, I only found a small circle of stones with still warm ashes in the center. No sign of people, no tent. Just the rest of the bonfire, as if someone had just left. The most bizarre thing was realizing that, even without having gone through that point before, there was something there that seemed familiar. The stones, the arrangement of the branches, even the smell of the smoke had something that moved my memory, as if I had already been there, although I knew I had never done that trail in my life. I slowly moved away from the circle of ashes, trying not to make noise. It was at that moment that I heard a strong breath, almost a long sigh, coming from the vegetation on my right. There was nothing there when I looked, but I swear by everything I heard someone breathing, as if they were leaning against me, on the other side of the thicket. With my heart racing, I decided to move on, now without any notion of direction. My legs were already hurting, and the backpack seemed to weigh twice as much. After a few more minutes, I found an old wooden board fallen to the floor. When I got up to try to read, I could barely understand, but one part was still readable. Main track, 1.2 kilometers. But what made me even more confused was the detail that the arrow was pointing backwards, in the direction of where I had come from. But I had never been through that sign before. And stranger, she was covered in moss, as if no one had seen or touched her for months. That was the last straw. I just wanted to get out of there alive. I decided to ignore the sign and kept walking, even without knowing where it would go. That's when I started to hear noises different from the sounds of the forest. A slight, almost electric buzz as interference, and soon after, the sound of a distant whistle. That brought me a little hope. Maybe it was a rescue area, a point of support, anything. I followed that sound, which became clearer with each step, until I finally saw something familiar. A new, well-painted sign, indicating the exit of the park about 800 meters away. I ran, without thinking. I don't even know how I still had energy, I just went. When I finally reached the main entrance, I collapsed. I sat on the gravel floor and stood there, shaking. The other day, I went back there with 2 friends and one of the park guards. They redid the route with me, but the trail was completely different. The vegetation was not the same. There was no circle of ashes, nor the old plate on the floor. Everything looked like any other safe and well-demarcated trail. To this day I don't know what happened, nor how to explain it. It wasn't hallucination. I know what I saw, what I heard, what I felt. Since then, I've never been to the woods alone. And every time someone invites me to a new trail, I make up an excuse. Because deep down, I feel that if I come back, I may not be able to leave again. I've always enjoyed hiking, especially at night. The weather is cooler, the silence of the forest brings a strange peace, and the stars seem much closer. On that day, we were 4 friends exploring a moderate trail inside a forest reserve. We arrived in the early evening and started the journey with powerful lanterns and that atmosphere of adventure. Everything was going well until one of my friends, Marcos, stopped walking for a few seconds and pointed to the left. He had seen a light, as if it were a flashlight swinging behind the trees, a little distant, but visible between the branches. We thought it could be another group doing the same trail, which would not be so unusual. But the curious thing was that the light did not come from the parallel trail or from a fixed point. It moved, as if someone walked in sync with us, always keeping a certain distance. We keep walking, commenting from time to time about the light, laughing at the possibility of being a stalker of the trails, or something like that. But about 20 minutes later, we noticed another light emerging, a little further ahead of the first. Then one more. Always keeping the same pattern, never too close, never moving away completely, as if they were silently escorting us through the woods. At first we still tried to rationalize. Maybe it was other groups that decided to do the trail at similar times. But at this point, we had already walked a lot, and the trail was practically a continuous line. There weren't many forks for other groups to suddenly appear like that. Besides, no one heard footsteps, voices, laughter, nothing. Only the lights oscillating between the trees, as if someone were walking with the lanterns down, trying not to attract attention. The forest was strangely silent, without that common sound of insects or nocturnal animals. Everything seemed to have stopped to observe too. Marco started to get more tense. He stopped playing, turned off the flashlight for a while, and whispered for us to stop walking for a few seconds. The idea was simple. If we stood still, the lights would pass by us, right? But that didn't happen. We stopped for more than a minute, and the lights stopped too. They didn't decrease, they didn't get closer. They stayed there, floating among the trees, almost motionless, as if whoever was carrying had noticed our attempt. We even tried to point the lanterns directly, but the beams only hit the trees and disappeared into the darkness. No V-flex, no visible person. We decided to keep walking, this time in silence, more attentive. I looked back every few minutes, and the lights were still there. What started with 2 or 3 now seemed like 5 or 6. It was as if they were multiplying, but always keeping the same distance from us. And the strangest thing, none approached or moved away. It was as if we were trapped in a kind of silent, constant persecution, and that didn't need to accelerate to reach us. Just follow along. And that made me more nervous than if someone had been running after us. At one point, Pedro stumbled on a root and fell. We hurried to help him, and it was at that moment that we noticed a detail that furrowed the spine. When he fell, the lights stopped for good. They became static, but not in the same place, a little closer than before. We couldn't tell for sure if they moved or if the darkness deceived us, but at that moment it was clear that something was reacting to our movements. Pedro had a scratched knee and asked to rest a little, but we could barely breathe. The feeling was that, if we stayed still for a long time, those lights would enjoy it. While Pedro cleaned his knee with a bottle of water, the rest of us were watching the lights. No shaking, no noise, no sound of footsteps. But it was as if they breathed along with the forest. The night was darker than before, the air heavier. We even considered whether they could be some group of automatic flashlights or even drones. But what kind of person would leave a dozen suspended lights in the middle of the forest at night without identifying themselves? We started walking again, slowly. The lights followed, always behind, always in the same number as before, but now in a straight line. It was Luana who started crying. Silently, but with a wet face and trembling hands. She repeated that she wanted to leave, that it was not right, that the trail should end there. It turns out that, as we walked, we no longer saw any of the signs that were there when we started. No red ribbons, no ecological trail sign or direction mark. It was as if the trail had lengthened or changed. And even with GPS on the phone, none of us could signal. Neither to send a message, nor to load the map. All that was left was to walk, with those lights following us, as if they were waiting for us to give up. At a certain moment, the path began to rise, and at the top of a small elevation, we could see the most open forest in front. The lights stopped. They were all agglomerated at a considerable distance, as if they had found an invisible barrier. We stood still looking at that for a time that seemed eternal, until someone, I think Vinicius, whispered, "Run." And that was it. Everyone ran away, without thinking about strategy, without looking back. The sound of dry leaves under the feet was the only thing we heard for a long time. Heart in the mouth, legs hurting, and the feeling that at any moment we would be swallowed up by the woods. When we finally saw a road sign, a crooked wooden fence, and a lamppost in the distance, no one said a word. We just fell sitting on the floor, panting, trying to understand if it was really over. The lights were gone. No sound. No explanation. We went back to the car in silence, locked everything, and only said something after walking several kilometers from there. No one ever understood what those lights were, why they followed us, and why they stopped exactly at that point. We went back there days later, in the morning, with other friends. The trail was normal, as always. No sign of the lights. No change. For a long time, I tried to rationalize that. Maybe lanterns from other groups? But there was no camping registered in that area that night, and those responsible for the park said we were the only ones on the trail. Not to mention that the lights accompanied us as if they were aware, as if they were watching and imitating our rhythm. No one had the courage to go back at night. Even with strong sun, and in a group, the memory of those lights continues to give chills just thinking about it. I've done more difficult trails afterwards, in more remote places, but never again at night. Today, when someone mentions hiking with a flashlight or camping in the best, I avoid going into the subject. Because no matter how much I try to explain, it seems that no one understands what that was, or doesn't want to understand. Sometimes I think, What if we hadn't run? What if someone had answered, approached, or simply ignored? Maybe we wouldn't have come back. And maybe there wouldn't even have been a record that one day we were there. The lights didn't explain themselves, they didn't go out. Just they stop. And that scares me more than anything else.